Many years ago, I attended a lecture at the University of Chester, and I can't remember what the subject was now, but there was a young academic that did an excellent talk called Dr. Jack Hunter, and his work since then, I've actually followed it with great interest. And only literally about 5 minutes ago, I've discovered I always assumed he was Welsh, but in fact, he's a fellow Scouser. So that's really good news as well in terms of that. So anybody that's listening out there that actually is from the Merseyside area, you've got two Merseyside people talking to each other as well, which is really good. Right, a little bit of background about Jack, and I'll be looking down reading because I've taken this from his website, but it's very intriguing, and there's a question I'm going to ask him before we even start when I've gone through this as well. Okay, Dr. Jack Hunter is an anthropologist exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He lives in the hills of mid-Wales with his family. He's a tutor at the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology and Culture, University of Wales Trinity St David, and teaches on the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. He also is an access to higher education lecturer in the Humanities and Social Sciences at Newton College. He is co-editor with Dr. Tina Pafitas of the peer-reviewed Time and Mind Journal of Archaeology, Conscious and Culture. His doctoral research with the University of Bristol examined the experiences of spirit mediums and their influence on the development of self-concepts and the models of consciousness, and is an effort towards a non-reductive anthropology of the paranormal. He completed a permaculture design course at Chester Cathedral in 2017 and worked on the One School, One Planet project between 2016 and 19 to develop an interdisciplinary permaculture curriculum for schools. He's also a musician and an ordained Dudist priest. Okay, now, before we even start, okay, Jack, what's a Dudist?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a pop culture, you could call it a religion in inverted commas, but, you know, a pop culture reference to The Big Lebowski and the dude and his kind of like, I don't know how you describe it, kind of like a laissez-faire kind of philosophy.
You know, it's funny. I liked your body language there when you actually went straight into it. You know, that's the move
That's
a
the way of the dude. Yeah.
So that is a dudist move. So if ever I wanted to be a dude and I walk into a bar or something, I look like that, people will say that guy's a dude.
They'll know automatically.
I could try it. I probably don't have your kind of swaying movement or anything, so I probably would be a total failure at it, or one of those things. Okay, well, let's get straight in. There's so many meaty topics we can get talking about. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a long time. So I'm sure that it will go off on various tangents, but let's see where we go with it. So the first thing I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on your doctoral thesis, a little bit about the background to that and what it involved.
Yeah, so, well, my PhD was with the University of Bristol. It was in social anthropology. And basically, it stemmed out of the research that I did for my undergraduate dissertation. So towards the end of my undergraduate degree, I became interested in questions to do with spirits and the reality of, you know, non-physical things. You know, I was interested in the anthropology of religion, and I'd studied all of these different religious traditions, and, you know, spirits and spiritual beings as kind of like a key theme that runs throughout religion. And I was interested in trying to find a way that I could, you know, kind of like sink my teeth into that. And actually, I started to attend like spiritualist churches around Bristol. So I would go and sit in their spiritualist services. I had a few readings from mediums and that kind of thing. But I didn't manage to build up much of a, you know, kind of like a rapport with the people there. I think in part, it was because of my kind of like innate shyness, and I'm quite reserved, but also because in spiritualist churches, the congregations seem to fluctuate quite quickly. So you might have one group of people who come in one day, you know, because they want to meet get in touch with a dead loved one, or because they've had a recent bereavement or something, or because they're curious, and then they might not turn up the next day. So the congregations were constantly shifting and changing. So we didn't have anything to kind of anchor into. So I decided that I would look for somewhere that maybe was a little bit more kind of focused, and maybe a smaller group of people. So I did a bit of searching online, and by some kind of strange coincidence, I stumbled across this group called the Bristol Spirit Lodge. And they were pretty much about 10-20 minutes up the road from where I was living at the time in student accommodation. And yeah, so I got in touch, I sent them an email, and they invited me over, and I had a chat with the circle leader for a little while, and I was like, oh, this is interesting, there's some interesting stuff going on here, and they invited me along to a seance. And it was actually on my very, very first seance. There was a few things about it that I was surprised at. First of all, it was held during the daytime, and I'd always assumed, from the media and films and things, that seances would be at night and it'd be spooky and all that kind of stuff. But it was in daytime, and it was in a garden shed. It was in a garden shed that had been kind of done up for the purpose of, spirit seances. So I was intrigued. And in the very first seance I attended, I actually saw some strange things, which I wasn't expecting. Because I dabbled with psychedelics and things in the past before this. I dabbled in Wicca and magic and things like that as well. So I kind of, I thought that I knew what I was getting myself into. But when I got there, they turned the lights off inside this little shed. It went all red and glowy. The medium went into their kind of trance state. And then I started to see little like flashes of light around the head of the medium. Just small, I think they were kind of like little dots of light, basically. And I was just like, this is interesting. Something is happening, and I've only been here for 10 minutes. And then perhaps the strangest thing that happened during this very first seance was I saw over the face of the medium, sort of like a green mask appeared. And it was kind of like the face, in retrospect, it was kind of like a Chinese, like a stereotypical kind of Chinese monk kind of face that you might see. And it sort of appeared over the medium's face, and it just slid down slowly, and it sort of disappeared. And I thought, that's a weird thing to see, strange thing, but I'll keep it to myself because I don't want to make out that I'm crazy or anything, even though I'm, immersed in the world of spiritualism. And then, we went through the rest of the seance. A few things happened. Different spirits came and spoke through the medium. But then, at the end of it, we all went out back into the house and had a cup of tea and some biscuits and all that kind of thing. And kind of without even mentioning it, one of the other sitters who'd been present in the seance said that, did you see that green monk's face? And I was like, well, actually, yeah, I did. So it was what I initially assumed was some kind of like a subjective hallucination, you might want to call it, actually in the end turned out to be kind of like an intersubjective hallucination, or some kind of a shared hallucination. So obviously, that was my first experience in a seance, and I had to kind of pursue it further and go into more detail. So that's where my PhD then stemmed out of that. And I became particularly interested in trying to understand how these kinds of experiences that people have, not just the mediums, because I know mediums have all sorts of altered states and they go into trances and those kind of things, but also how these experiences of the sitters impact on the way that the people who participate in these groups understand the nature of consciousness. And in anthropology, there's been an interesting distinction between, they talk about Western consciousness on the one hand, which is they consider to be an individual, it's bounded, it's unique. So we kind of end, at the limits of our skin. It's kind of like a reductive materialist view, which has taken over, is the mainstream perspective. And then anthropologists also talk about non-Western consciousness or non-Western self, which is always usually characterized as porous, as they talk about individual consciousness that can break up into lots of parts, or the self might be made up of multiple component parts. And what I found was that for the people who are practicing mediumship in this way, they seem to be exhibiting, although they were based in Western culture and they were heavily, invested in Western culture and Western lifestyles, when they were doing these practices, the sense of self that they were kind of expressing was much more similar to the non-Western sense of self, this individual self that spirits could come into their bodies and move out of their bodies. Spirits would talk to them during the day and guide them and all of that kind of stuff. So the basic gist of my thesis then was an exploration of how experiences in seances lead to these expanded notions of the nature of the self.
So this is really quite intriguing, because one of the areas that in my new book I'm focusing on this concept of what I call the egregorial, sort of expanding on the famous Philip experiment in Toronto, and the idea that this kind of a group consciousness can somehow be created. But here what you're saying is that your first experience involved a physical medium who was able to change their appearance, or something was coming in, and which was coming into them, but you and another witness saw it, you know. And that is intriguing, because many years ago I was invited to the Arthur Findlay College in Essex.
Yep.
And they had a physical medium there, and one of the exercises they did was about physical mediumship and the physical change of the face.
Yes.
Now, myself and my associate who was there, Dr. Alan Roberts, we didn't see anything at all, but other people said they did see things. So the question is, the billion-dollar question here is, what do you think was taking place there? Do you think it was a collective hallucination, a folie à deux between you and the other person, or what? What did you come to any conclusions on that? Because it's very intriguing.
Yeah, well, the general conclusion I've come to about seances is that they are more than the sum of their parts. So when you have people who are interacting with each other, you know, different kinds of sort of social dynamics arise. But you also have this like external, potentially like spiritual influence that's being invited in. So you have this like combination of different factors all coming together to produce something that is more than the sum of its parts. So these hallucinations and things, you know, you can easily explain them away as hallucinations, but when, you know, someone else has had the same experience, and it also accords with the beliefs of the people who are doing this, you know, they talk about transfiguration, they talk about faces changing and things. Even though I was kind of new to it at that point, you know, everything seemed to kind of match up. So it gave me the impression that I was dealing with at least a genuine tradition, if that makes sense. Like the things that the group that I'd discussed, that I found in Bristol, the things that they were talking about fit into the rest of the kind of narrative around spiritualism, and also fit into the ideas of other researchers researching spirit, mediumship, and possession and stuff. So, you know, I think, yeah, it's more than the sum of its parts.
It reminds me very much of the work many years ago of, I think it was Gustave Le Bon, and the idea of the social dynamic of crowds, you know, and the idea that you get a group of people in a crowd and there is this kind of overarching something else that comes about which is different to the individuals. And this is very much where my work is going at the moment, and where my work seems to be taking me. So I wasn't aware of this. So this is very, very exciting to discover that you've already followed the path, really, in terms of this. Now, before we move on to the next question, I'm just intrigued. I use the word actual an awful lot. I've noticed this when I do interviews. I must stop doing that. That the entity you saw, the image, the China person, did you believe that that was a manifestation of the collective unconscious and expectations, or do you think it was something externally real? It was an entity coming through from somewhere else, that the medium was actually focusing into this reality?
Yeah, I think actually, you know, we make these distinctions between something that is socially constructed or whatever, and then something that is actually objective and real. But I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. So I think that it was both a collective manifestation, and there was something there that was, you know, it needed those conditions or that particular situation in order to manifest. And I think all of the things that you find in seances are contributors to that. I know in your Hidden Universe book that you talked about caves and going down into dark places, and that's where you encounter spirits. Well, it's the same in seances. It's, you know, sensory deprivation. You don't go into a cave, but you basically create a dark chamber, or like a psychomantium, or whatever you want to call it, where people, you know, it goes dark and people have altered states of consciousness in there. Not just the mediums, is what I'm saying. It's not just the medium who goes into a trance, but because of the situation, the conditions, the music, all of these things, even the sitters are in an altered state. And when everyone is kind of, you know, synchronizing in a way, you know, like when you have shared hallucinations when everyone's tripping around you or whatever, you know, it's the same kind of thing. So yeah, seances are a setup to enable the right kind of scenario to emerge that allows for different things to come through.
How intriguing, because I'm thinking now about, you know, the skull experiments and the issues that took place in that, you know, and clearly we can draw parallels here, but of course they argue there were physical manifestations there. But in terms of, you have a term that you use that I'd like to pursue a little bit here, is the experiential approach, because you believe that is very important. So why is that so important? And can you describe any other experiences you've had that reinforces that kind of experiential approach? And I'm particularly interested in your own experiences of any unorthodox ghosts stories or experiences you've heard about, you know, the non-standard kind of ghost things. So if you can explain about them a little bit, I'll be really interested.
Yeah, well, I'll start with this experiential approach. In the kind of like the mainstream of anthropology, I suppose, or mainstream social sciences, the cultural hypothesis or the cultural source hypothesis is kind of like the standard. So, you know, the cultural source hypothesis suggests that, you know, we find similarities in like supernatural narratives around the world because stories spread, you know. So it doesn't mean that people have actually seen something, but because they've heard the story, you know, maybe they're hallucinating based on what they've heard and that kind of thing. So that's the cultural source hypothesis. And, you know, I agree with it to a certain extent because I know that stories pass around and move around, and, you know, fair enough. But then there's this element of experience that comes in. And there's a folklorist called David J. Hufford. I'm not sure if you've heard of him before.
No.
He wrote a great book called The Terror That Comes in the Night, which is about the sleep paralysis,
Oh, right.
old hag experience. And in a nutshell, basically, David Hufford had this experience, but he didn't have any kind of framework to understand it in. And then when he was a PhD student researching folklore, he went up to Newfoundland, and he discovered there this whole tradition around the old hag. And it was when he started to interview people, he found that essentially what it was that, you know, a malevolent presence that comes into your bedroom at night and crushes you and presses down on your chest. And then when he started to research the kind of the wider ethnographic literature, he found this same motif occurring all over the place. But because he'd had the experience, because this had happened to him before, unlike other, you know, folklorists or anthropologists or whatever, he thought maybe there's a case to be made for the experience coming first. So more like there's a universal experience that people have, and then the cultural overlays get added on top of that. So that's why you have, you know, this essentially the same motif all around the world, but with different cultural interpretations. So in one place they might call it the old hag, in another place they call it the incubus or the succubus or whatever. You know, all the various different names, but at the core of it, there's an experience. So I took this experiential approach and applied it to mediumship. So the assumption is that, you know, it's not just a cultural phenomenon. There's actually some kind of an experience that underlies it, that gives rise to, you know, there are mediumship traditions all around the world. They're all very different on like surface, like cultural levels. But when you get down to the kind of experience, it's a very similar kind of thing. So I'll give you a good example of my own experience that kind of fed into this understanding of mediumship. Again, it was with the Bristol Spirit Lodge. And I've told this story a lot of times before. I'll tell it again.
I haven't heard it, so I'm sure we're fascinated to hear it. So
yeah, it was on a day when the medium couldn't turn up for some reason. So they decided that what they were going to do, they called it an open development sitting, where they were basically, there was a bunch of us, I think there was about 4 or 5 of us who were usually just sitters. We weren't mediums. But they said, you know, because the medium's not here, we'll all meditate, we'll do an opening prayer and invite spirits to, you know, whatever spirits are hanging around to let themselves kind of be known through us. So it was like, okay, yeah, this sounds like fun. Something a bit different to try. And, you know, I'd done meditation and things like that before. So I thought, you know, this is a nice opportunity just to meditate in a warm seance room with red light on and a bit of new age music in the background. And so I did it, but it didn't take long before I started to feel a tingling in my left hand. It was kind of like pins and needles. And I ended up getting into this strange state of consciousness where it was almost as though I was having a mini out-of-body experience. Like I just slipped out the back of my body, just a small amount, maybe, you know, a few inches, not far, basically. So I could still feel my physical body, but I could also feel that there was something that was happening in my hand that I didn't have any control of. So I kind of, I went with the experience for a little while just to see what happened. And eventually my hand started to tingle more. And then it just started kind of like shaking around like this, as though I was waving. And I was in this strange state of mind where I was aware that the movement was happening, but I was also aware that I wasn't, consciously willing it to happen. So it was almost like like a reflex action, like a movement that happens, but you have no conscious control over it. And it freaked me out, obviously. So I was like, oh my God, what's happening? And everyone in the room kind of laughed because, you start inviting spirits into your body, you've got to expect strange things to happen.
Yeah.
So I just went with it and I allowed it to happen again. And the same thing happened. So what I took away from this experience was, at the very least, like, now I have my own understanding that there is an experience that people can have that at the very least feels like you are under the influence of, an external spiritual being or whatever it is. And then you can extrapolate from that. So now that I know that there is an experiential core to it, I've got a more solid kind of rooting and understanding of what the whole thing is about. And this is another strand of my thesis, is that mediumship and seances are about experiences. So, you ask why it seems strange. Why should a group of, normal, everyday people come together more than once a week to communicate with spirits? It seems like a strange thing that you wouldn't do in the modern world. But actually, when you do that, then you have experiences. So it's almost like, it's all built around experience, essentially. So that's what I mean by the experiential approach, or an experiential source hypothesis, is that there is an experience, an underlying experience that's given rise to different cultural models of spirit communication and things like that.
That's a wonderful reversal of the standard approach, isn't it? The standard approach is that it's some kind of collective belief system. But of course, we never ever come to the conclusion that the reason why these things are so common is because they're in some way real, and people are interpreting it in different ways. Now, one of the things you were saying before is really intriguing and fascinating, is the universality of what we would know technically as REM intrusion. And what you're talking about there, about the hag and everything else as well. So would you say on a neurological basis, because you linked it very, very beautifully there with your own experience of the out-of-body experience, and of course there is the overlap of the REM coming forward into external reality, and the idea of the work of people like Celia Green and Charles McCreery, and the idea of the way in which hallucinations seem to go outside of ourselves. What's your opinion now of the whole REM intrusion hypothesis? Do you think it works, or are we restricting it too much?
Yeah, well, again, this ties back to what I was saying about seances. So, if you could look at any different element of the seance and then try and explain it in those terms, but it's always more than the sum of its parts. So like the neurological angle, brain states changing and things like that, it's easy for someone to say, well, that's the reason that you're having the experience, because the brain state has changed. But my understanding, or my, this idea that it's more than the sum of its parts, is that, things like REM states, or, hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, or whatever, different kinds of trances, they're all a part of something bigger. And they're all a part of the kind of necessary preconditions to enable something more to happen. So, I think I like the neurological side of it, but the danger is reducing it down to just that. Whereas I think that that's one part of something. So if you combine like a strange neurological condition with a particular cultural belief system and some ritual practice and a darkened seance room, some altered states of consciousness, all of those things combined give rise to something more, which may well be, discarnate spirits.
I really like the approach you're taking here. I mean, it's music to my ears, because when I was at university many years ago, what was in vogue was concepts like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about language and the development of language, and the way language seems to create an external perception of reality. But here, what you're saying is you're taking a very revolutionary approach and saying it's more than that. We have almost this collectiveness that we attune into. It's almost the Jungian collective unconscious, isn't it? In many ways. So this dovetails very much in anthropological terms. there is a new term that I know you use and many of my associates use, and I know I first came across it with you, is Paranthropology. So can you tell us a little bit about what this is? Because I think this is such an exciting development, really, and I mean genuinely exciting. And it's great that young academics like you are really shaking off the shackles and saying, come on, we need to take a much broader approach to this. So please, I'm really excited to hear more about Paranthropology.
Yeah, well, Paranthropology, the word itself, comes from the work of a linguist called Roger Westcott. And he wrote a chapter in a really cool book from, I think it's 1974, called Extrasensory Ecology, which was edited by an anthropologist called Joseph Long. And this is just part of a longer history of anthropology's engagement with the paranormal, or whatever we want to call it. And it's gone through lots of different kind of iterations. So, you know, like I was saying before, the mainstream approach in anthropology is a kind of essentially like a form of reductionism. It's usually grounded in materialism as its underlying like ontology, as most of the sciences are, even the social sciences. And it takes culture as the, you know, the biggest explanatory thing that there is. You know, you can explain pretty much everything with culture. So what I found was, you know, when I was dealing with having these experiences with mediums and things like that, that the kind of the standard materialist and cultural explanations that anthropologists have, or things like social functionalism and stuff like that, like that mediumship is there as a form of protest for women in repressive societies, for example, things like that. It's like a standard explanation, but it doesn't go all the way. It doesn't take into account the experiences. It doesn't take into account any of the findings from parapsychology, for example. So what I did was, it was 10 years ago now, I set up my own journal called Paranthropology. And I basically sent out emails to anthropologists and said, look, we need to start talking about this kind of stuff from a different perspective. We can't keep explaining it away in terms of the same old, like Durkheim and, you know, E.B. Tyler and all those guys. We've got to push forward. And then as I was doing this, I was doing more research into the history of anthropologists' engagement with it. And I stumbled across, as I mentioned before, Joseph Long, people like Andrew Lang in the 19th century, who talked about comparative psychical research. Pretty cool idea. All of this stuff. Edith Turner, who was an anthropologist who had an amazing spirit experience that totally transformed her way of understanding ritual. Things like that. So paranthropology is really all of these, you know, I suppose you could call them alternative, but they are rooted in there is a strong like scholarly lineage to them, but an alternative to a kind of reductionist materialist approach. And that's really what I mean when I talk about like a non-reductive anthropology of the paranormal, is an approach to the paranormal that doesn't explain things away just as beliefs or as social functions or as neurological conditions, but actually almost embraces all of those and says that there's something more that emerges from all of these processes combined. So that's my kind of take on, that's what paranthropology means to me.
Because again, you know, years ago when I was at university, you know, we studied Durkheim and say Tyler and various other people as well, and it seemed to be almost Victorian in its approach. You know, it had a very imperialistic viewpoint, and although it wasn't necessarily dismissive of traditional cultures, it was very much, we know better, whereas you don't, and you're misinterpreting the facts and you're misinterpreting the experiences. And clearly this is not the case. And again, this is so refreshing to realize, you know, that the experience of the experiencer is just as important and just as valid. And it's just, you know, the whole functionalism of the 1950s is now being washed away. And we're starting to realize there's a much broader model. Now, one of the terms that you use, and again, I'm very keen to understand this in greater detail, is ontological flooding. And the idea of what we mean by that, because I think your model is incredibly dynamic. I'm sitting here extremely excited about the route you're taking, and we really need to talk more about this when we have the opportunity and when and if we meet, because I think we're going in very, very similar routes. So ontological flooding, first you have to explain probably to some of the guys out there what you mean specifically by ontology, so that we don't confuse people, but ontological flooding.
Okay, well, ontology, you can take it in two kind of different ways. You can have ontology like the philosophy of ontology, which is the philosophy of the things that exist. So what things exist and how do we know they exist and all that kind of stuff. And then you can take it in the more kind of anthropological avenue, which is, it's an interesting concept that's emerged relatively recently in anthropology as a kind of like almost a move beyond this cultural thing that I've been talking about, moving beyond beliefs and engaging with the possibility that, you know, when we talk about other cultures or other worldviews, we're really talking about in completely whole worlds that are different to our own. Okay, so that's basically what I mean by ontology, is the sum total of things that people believe exist in their worldview. And then what I mean by ontological flooding is, it's sort of like an approach to studying these things that takes the possibility of these other worlds into account, but not just other worlds, but also different explanatory frameworks. So like I was saying before, with functionalism, the cognitive approach, you know, whatever neurological approach, any of these, what I think is that they all add something to the picture. They're all different ontologies. They're all different ways of looking at the world, different frameworks for understanding what exists. And I think that, you know, instead of compartmentalizing them as different things and saying that's all it is, we need to break down the flood barriers and allow this kind of intermingling of ideas to take place, so that you can entertain multiple explanatory frameworks simultaneously, if that makes sense. It's quite
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's obviously, it's countering the term I use, which is academic siloing. You know, the idea is that, you know, we really need to take information from everywhere, because the overall answers are going to be out there in different ways and different understandings, and breaking out of the worldview that certain people have. Because for many years, I mean, over the years, I've been fascinated by religious sects and how religious sects develop and everything else. I studied them at university, and since then I'm very interested in books like The Pursuit of the Millennium, Norman Cohn, and different books about how these religious groups came up after the Reformation in Europe, and how people like John of Leyden, and how they took over and controlled whole environments. And it's all right for us who are non-believers to dismiss these things. But could it be that the collective group creates almost not just the environment, but the external physical environment that reflects their beliefs and reinforces their beliefs to make them believe it more? Because they might seem irrational to us, but within the group, they seem to make sense. It's again the social dynamic you're talking about here, you know. And again, you know, what I really like about your work is you really are expanding it outwards. Your book, Greening the Paranormal, was absolutely brilliant. I enjoyed every word of that book, and the ideas you were putting forward is so needed. That book should be required reading everywhere. So can you tell us a little bit what you mean? Because as an environmentalist, this is so important, particularly these days. So what do you mean by greening the paranormal?
Yeah. Well, again, it's kind of a borrowed idea, borrowed from the sociology of religion, where there's a scholar of religion called Bron Taylor, and he wrote a really great book called Dark Green Religion. And what he's done is traced the kind of the religious and spiritual kind of motivations of ecological activists and things like that, environmental activists, and explored how, you know, their spirituality is kind of the motivator for their ecological action. But also he talks about the greening of religion, and this idea that you know, the mainstream world religions, Catholicism and all that kind of stuff, have over time gradually started to incorporate a more ecological outlook, not necessarily like wholeheartedly, but gradually, especially in response to things like, you know, the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017 or whenever it was. So the idea is that, you know, religions have the potential, there's a possibility for them to have some kind of a positive ecological impact. You know, if people were able to ground their ecological action within a kind of a metaphysical framework that makes sense to them, and that means that they feel like they're participating in a greater interconnected whole, then, you know, it can motivate much more kind of action. And then I thought, well, if this is happening in religion, are there also sort of ecological or green or whatever strands in the paranormal? And, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, I found that there are a lot of ecological strands within the paranormal. And actually, maybe when we start to think about the paranormal from an ecological perspective, we might open up new and interesting avenues for exploration. So, I mean, one example that I use in the book Greening the Paranormal is this idea of other minds. So we know in the paranormal milieu, whatever we want to call it, there's talk about things like spirits and poltergeists, you know, Bigfoot, Nessies, you know, all of those kind of, all the crazy, amazing, diverse array of supernatural beings. And what we're really talking about there is kind of like an animistic worldview, the idea that there are, this is another kind of anthropological concept, that there are, you know, different kinds of intelligences out there in the world, spirits and non-physical beings and things like that. And then I started to read the work of Monica Gagliano. I'm not sure if you've heard of her before, but she's a plant scientist researching plant physiology, and she's been at the kind of like the cutting edge of the new sort of the study of, I don't know if you would call it plant consciousness, but you know, plant neurophysiology. Even though plants do not have brains, they still seem to be able to memorize things and learn and things like that. And she's done all these amazing experiments. And I was like, well, this is kind of, you know, this is again another form of consciousness. Like in your book, you talk about, you know, non-human intelligences. So we've got a whole spectrum of different approaches. We can talk about, you know, spiritual beings. We can talk about plant consciousness. We can talk about animal consciousness, all of that kind of stuff. So part of the argument of the book is that, you know, if we start to perceive the world as more conscious than our kind of mainstream perspective usually allows us to, then we start to engage in deeper relationships. We can form, you know, we can communicate with plants, for example. And then, you know, similar to what I was saying with this idea of dark green religion, is that then we have experiences that further motivate us to do more positive, you know, environmentally friendly actions, if that makes sense. So you can speak about gardens and things, and cultivating gardens as also cultivating different kinds of minds and different kinds of intelligence around you. And it really ties back to this kind of animistic way of looking at the world, of, you know, forming relationships with different intelligences.
Well, it's almost Lovelockian, isn't it? It's almost like the concept of Gaia. But what you're doing is you're taking the concept of Gaia and moving it into areas that most academics 10 or 15 years ago would run away from.
Mm-hmm. That's
Whereas
it.
if we start to appreciate, that everything has sentience to a level and has an intelligence or to a level, it suddenly makes us much more attuned with our environment. One of the things I've argued quite recently is that we don't ever really spend our time, particularly people in the West, of being outside in the environment. We're never outside in the environment at night, usually, where we actually sense the numinous, where we sense the kind of the greater something that is actually taking place here. You know, so we need to really reconnect in some way with these non-human intelligences, whatever they may be and however they may exist. Because if there is the argument that the consciousness is a field, and effectively everything attunes in at different levels to this consciousness field, whatever we may call it. You know, I know that, you know, people like, I don't know, Wilhelm Reich and his concept of orgone energy, these kind of things, you know, is there something? And in terms of your work and your obviously extensive reading around the subject, is there any evidence for this idea of this kind of field consciousness that's taking place? Is there anything there?
Well, I mean, there's lots of evidence for it. I mean, if you look in terms of like parapsychology and the Global Consciousness Project and things like that, I don't know if you've heard of the Global Consciousness Project, but yeah, basically they have, you know, random number generators around the world that seem to react to, you know, whenever humans kind of like, our attention is focused on one particular thing, like a major world event or something, then it seems to affect these random number generators, and they move more towards pattern rather than, you know, randomness. So that's one particular interesting example. But then I think you can also kind of like sneak it in, like, you know, with the Gaia hypothesis that you were talking about and James Lovelock. I mean, you know, Lovelock himself, he steers away from the idea that there is actually some kind of a teleological drive behind this. He's much more along the lines of, you know, the homeostasis that we see on the earth is kind of just it's just the product of, you know, interacting chemicals and things like that. It's not, there's no kind of consciousness behind it. But other people, you know, have taken slightly different interpretations of that. So I think actually the Gaia hypothesis, again, this idea that the Earth is a single homeostatic organism essentially, is pretty good like hard science evidence really for this, you know, this idea of consciousness, of a field of consciousness, at least around the Earth. Yeah, but then, you know, it might manifest in different ways, or we experience it in different ways as we as we interact with it. So
well, I think the whole teleological argument is an interesting one, isn't it? You know, to say, are we furrowing a track? Is there a point to everything, and is there a reason why things are developing the way they are? And a lot of people I'm working with at the moment, I'm very much keen for you to join our group as we're expanding this. But this kind of the kind of quickening that's taking place, that people are becoming more aware of this. Now, I know as a sociologist that every generation thinks that they're almost in the end times. You know, it's one of the things all generations do, and they see the signs and everything else as well. But it does seem at the moment, particularly 2020, seems to be really, myself and my little group, we were discussing this in December and saying 2020 is going to be a real catalytic year. But effectively, we didn't actually realize just how catalytic it was going to be, you know, and already we're only in March, and the things that are happening around us is just incredible. And it's the idea, isn't it? Is it somehow that the universe itself is using us to become self-aware in some way, you know, and is consciousness much broader than that? And on that, you know, the thing is, another thing that you're very interested in, you know, is so you're talking about the reconnecting with non-human consciousnesses. But what do you think would be the outcome of that if we did manage to do this? You know, this is obviously hypothetical, but it's an interesting discussion as to what you think as a professional within the field, you think this is moving towards?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because I think actually there's different degrees of this thing. I mean, on the one hand, you know, we could go out and try and do some kind of like a seance to make contact with, you know, the earth spirit or whatever, and probably that wouldn't work. But then we can kind of nudge it back a bit each time and do something that will have like an almost direct effect on us, like on a personal level. Like, for example, going out into your garden, engaging with the plants that are there, feeling the soil, all of that kind of stuff. We can think about it as a process of building up a relationship. So this is kind of the direction that I see this moving in, and the consequences of paying attention to non-human intelligence is that we will build up a new, renewed relationship with the earth, and realize, you know, that the past 200 years have been a bit of an aberration, and that all of the problems that a lot of the problems that we're facing now, you know, there are kind of relatively simple things that we can do to redress that balance, or that imbalance, sorry. This is the angle that the Greening the Paranormal book is taking, is that if we engage with, for example, the local folklore of an area that says that the river contains the spirit of, you know, a deity, a water deity or something, then we can that gives us something to build that relationship with.
Do you mean collectively? Because people are actually already doing that.
Yeah, a lot of people are doing it.
Yeah, they're doing that now. Do you mean on a bigger scale?
Well, actually, I think we don't have to worry too much about the bigger scale. It's more to do with ourselves and our own engagement with it. You mentioned in my introduction that I was on this One School, One Planet project, which is about permaculture, but we released a little textbook called Small and Slow Solutions. And the idea behind that is, it's one of the principles of permaculture, is that if we have lots of small actions taking place around the world, then, you know, they don't even necessarily have to be aware of each other, but that cumulatively, again, we're talking like more than the sum of its parts. Like, if we all engage in a new relationship with our garden, for example, on a personal level, then, you know, collectively, we're doing something much bigger.
Bigger, yes.
Yeah, we're promoting more biodiversity in the garden. And like I said, one of the things I talk about is how biodiversity is actually also psychodiversity. So, you know,
yes.
The more plants that we have in the garden, the more kind of consciousness nodes we've got in the garden, this is the kind of what I'm talking about. Lots of small individual reformulations of relationship with landscape and place. And
I love that. I absolutely love that. The idea of landscape and place. I know Paul Devereaux has written a lot about this, and I love this idea of appreciating. When I locally down here, we have the South Downs, and the North Downs. We're between the two at the moment, and you just get this feeling of timelessness. Now, I'm a lover of Greece. I just adore Greece. There's something magical about Greece, particularly the islands, particularly when you get away from everything in the islands, and you can feel the years disappear and it goes down, and you realize that everything is timeless, that there's a veneer of civilization on everything. But it's just a veneer. There's this kind of telluric force that you sense, and one of my friends, Kaz Coronel, who will be a future guest on this program, Kaz was saying to me something comparatively recent, which I thought was really good. She gets up every morning, even in the winter, and she takes her shoes and socks off, and she just walks and senses the ground and the grass beneath her feet. And we never even do that. We even insulate ourselves from those kind of forces. And I think it's realizing that we are a manifestation of something greater, rather than this kind of ego-driven Western worldview where it's just I, and materialism and everything.
Yeah.
This will break down. And how has your book been? What's happened with the book? Are people writing great reviews of it? Are they loving it? Or are they ignoring it? Or what's happening?
I've had a few good reviews. It's not, obviously, I don't think it's ever going to be like a global bestseller or anything. It's a little bit too niche and weird, but which is all good for what I like. But I think in general, though, the people who have read it and have engaged with it have taken something positive from it. Some reviews I've read have said, one review that I read said it was one of the most important books they'd read for a while. So, it's good.
I would agree with that. And I was so delighted when you sent me an advanced copy. I felt very special when I received that as well, which is really good. Dia, as in your culture and your environment, the work you do, is this resonating with you in terms of how you see?
It is, and I wanted to make a comment because I do mediumship every day. This is a part of my craft. I've been reading and doing priesthood for almost 20 years. I've been initiated as a Lukumi priestess of Yamaya for almost 20 years. And I'm listening to your conversation. And when you guys were talking about culture and belief and things of this nature and relating that to my craft, and when I'm sitting in the chair of spiritual counsel, actually belief and tradition, spiritual, is just the key. It's a tool to get to a different place. But I surrender that. Religiosity really has nothing to do with mediumship, and from my perspective, because I literally empty my cardinal being, and I don't know how to explain that, but I empty myself. I have to transcend all of these 3D workings of this paradigm, because in all actuality, it is mind and belief and religiosity of man that blocks your gifts. That's a known fact. And I mean, if you talk to people who do deep mediumship, so you have to transcend that and become an open vessel. The moment that mind and ideology, these are things that have been given to us by man. They're real, but they're not real. It's a paradox. Once you begin to activate your logical conscious mind and that little twin, that evil twin in people's minds that they have with themselves, it completely locks and blocks you up. And that's hard for people. You have to be able to literally surrender your being, the I am that you know yourself to be. It's like the Buddha say you disappear and you open up to who you truly are. And it's something that I can't explain on a tactile level. It feels like sometimes I'm outside of my body looking at myself and I'm just speaking. It's like the strangest feeling when I'm in that place. And some people trigger it deeper than others. There are just so many things that permeate and go on. And the confirmation from a visual standpoint that I've had to understand over the years is that people are very tactile and visual in nature. And as my grandmother would say, evidencia, something that they can see with their eyes. So I also do tarot at the same time. It works in alignment with me. So as certain things happen, I'm throwing cards and the cards confirm. It's like I have an energetic cord that confirms what I've said before I even pick up the cards. So people have evidence, as I would say.
Yeah.
But it's hard to explain, but one has to transcend. I transcend my priesthood, all of these things. In order to be really grounded in mediumship. It's almost like you're not here. And there are many different levels of mediumship, because some people channel, which is a different level. Some people, I mean, there are just so many different levels, but very interesting conversation. But belief in religion, at least in my perspective, and I've talked to my colleagues in other traditions, yes, that's a particular tool to open up a door. But once you get past, you open the door and you walk past the threshold, you have to surrender your whole identity of belief. You transcend what one knows to be the I am. And it's very difficult for people to do this. That's why when people talk about consciousness, they call it a hallucination. I mean, I don't think that it's a hallucination, because at the end of the day, this physical, what we call 3D, is a hallucination, if you really want to be honest with yourself.
Yeah, which is an excellent point, isn't it?
You know what I mean? I mean, and this is science. This is what scientists said, and talked about all these different things. So is it really a hallucination? I don't think so. I mean, and you talk to Erwin Laszlo, who talks about the Akashic field. If we're energy and we have limitations in this cardinal body, we can only see a limited perception of reality, meaning light form, with this projection. We're not seeing everything. So to me, it's not a hallucination. There's a lot more to see.
Well, this is exactly it. And dear, that's, by the way, Jack, congratulations. I've been trying to draw Dear into these conversations for the last 8 or 9 years, and that's the longest she's ever spoken on any, which is a real credit to you, believe me. And I'm so delighted that the guys out there have actually, the wonderful Dear Nunez and the wisdom of Dear Nunez suddenly came across there, which was brilliant, which is fantastic. Now, as a very final point, we're running to, we always run out of time so quickly on these. It's always so frustrating, it really is. But really interested in, as a parapsychologist, as a paranthropologist and everything else as well, myself and my associates were very interested in non-ordinary ghost appearances. I mean, for instance, many years ago, I remember reading about a very peculiar ghost event that took place in the jewelry room of the Tower of London in about the 1870s, 1880s, where this object just appeared, and it seemed to be a cylinder, and it kind of poured, and it was pouring things from one cylinder to another. And I'm just wondering your experience. Do you ever have any kind of, or have come across any cases of completely bizarre hauntings or bizarre circumstances that really don't fit into the standard trope of a ghost or a haunting?
Yeah. Yes.
Come on then, let's hear it.
I've got 2 things that instantly pop into my mind. The first one is a couple of my own experiences. And again, people would explain these away in terms of, hypnagogic states. But when you're in the moment of the experience, again, it's much more than that. It's something else. So this was actually around about the time when I first started to get involved with the mediumship group. So I was like at my most kind of participatory. I was totally engaged in it, and I was living it. I was going to seances, and I started to see flashes of light and things in my everyday life. I was very much in it. And then one night, I was in my bed in this, hypnagogic state, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. And I saw in front of me, again, like the mask that I saw that was green, I saw this incredibly intricate and detailed green goat's head above my bed, and it was like a hologram. It was so like, it looked like a hologram, and it was just sort of there. And if I remember correctly, it was kind of rotating slightly, so you could see that it was 3-dimensional. So that was a particularly interesting experience. It doesn't fit into any kind of, like you're saying, like a traditional kind of ghost narrative or anything like that, but it was definitely strange. And then another one that I'll just quickly recount is actually something that I've come across really recently. I'm sure my student won't mind me talking about it, but there's one of my students in the college. I've been talking to him about the paranormal and my interests. Obviously, I can't help but kind of weave it into my teaching. And he told me this really interesting story that from when he was younger, and him and his cousin were in their bedroom, and they heard a sort of a booming noise coming from the window, and they went and opened the window, and they saw what he described as kind of like a mask, like a face, outside the window, a face of light, he described it as, looking in. And he said it was saying something, but he couldn't make out what it was saying. It was kind of like a booming, muffled voice. And he said he was just staring at it in blind panic, and his cousin freaked out and ran downstairs, and they went to get his mum to come upstairs. And yeah, when they came back upstairs, there was nothing left. He said there was a sort of like a sparkling in the bottom corner of the window or something like that. But there was no face there and no booming voice anymore. And his mum said, oh, it's just, you know, a reflection on the window. But he was adamant that it was this face and that it was trying to communicate something to him. So really interesting experience from one of my students. And then just to make it doubly weird, another student of mine, an MA student who I'm supervising her dissertation, she told me a very similar kind of experience where they'd also seen this. She described it as a face of light, a pulsating face of light it was like the light was behind it and emanating through it. And I heard these two accounts, you know, literally within the same week. One of my friends, my student in college told me, and then my master's student in Colombia told me her experience. So doesn't fit into any kind of like classic ghost narrative. It's hard to know what the real, like the motivation is, or, you know, what it means. I mean, nothing results from them other than a changed perspective on the individual, but very strange. But there seems to be something about masks, like seeing the mask falling over the medium's face, my students seeing these illuminated masks. Pretty weird.
And funnily enough, last night or this morning, I had probably a series of probably the most powerful hypnopompic images I've ever had. And again, I see mask-like things in focus, and they seem to revolve in certain circumstances, and you see them move around as if they're in a kind of a three-dimensional reality. Yeah, and they seem to be independent of you. That's the thing that fascinates me. And sometimes when I've snapped into these, I see through somebody else's eyes. I remember once I was at work, so whether it's hypnopompic, hypnagogic, whatever we want to call it, but I was at work at a computer, and suddenly my whole environment shimmered. And it was extraordinary. I was actually I said actually again, stop it. I was looking down from a location in a tree, looking down at an old man reading a newspaper. And then I look up, and there's this square, and round the corner in the square was an ambulance, and I could hear its siren. And I knew I was somewhere in Latin America. I even think it was probably Buenos Aires. And then it shimmers away, and I think, what the hell was that? Then a week later, I'm in the same circumstances, and I'm looking up through a glass table, and an elderly woman putting a cup of tea and a saucer down on a glass table. And I was obviously either a cat or something looking up through the table. And you see, it seems to be again that we can attune into the collective unconscious, the kind of zone or the energy field, and we see something completely different. And very quickly, I know we're nearly coming to the end, but one of the things I would like to have your take on here is one of the themes that you've mentioned 2 or 3 times is these kind of sparkling lights.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what do you think the significance of these are? Because they seem to be almost part of the apparition, as if they're kind of an afterburn or an after image of something that comes through, as if the lights kind of facilitate it coming through. And then when it leaves, they kind of fade away. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the lights that I saw in the seance, they were quite different. I think they were probably like some kind of an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of whatever was going on. But then there are other kinds of lights that people see that seem to be, you know, that move around like mini UFOs. You know, they have some kind of a deliberate intent behind them. So, and there's also the kind of flashes of light that I was seeing when I was most heavily engaged in all of this stuff. I related it back to something that I'd read about Emanuel Swedenborg, who he said that he saw these flashes of lights, which would be kind of like guides for him. So he would know that he was like on the right track. You know, so if, you know, he was thinking about something, he was like a polymath scientist, you know, if he was onto some kind of a good idea, then these flashes would come and tell him that he was onto it. And that's what I thought, that when I saw these lights, you know, that was my interpretation of them, that they were somehow kind of like guiding me. So I think we're dealing with, we talk about, you know, small lights, but we're dealing with a range of different things. Some may be like after effects or byproducts of some other kind of process. Some might be entities in themselves. Some of them might be messages. So yeah, I think we're dealing with something that's quite complex.
Jack, that was absolutely wonderful, absolutely fascinating hour. Exceeded, I had great expectations, but it exceeded all expectations. Really, really, really enjoyed it. So how can people contact you? Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people out there going, I need to know more about this guy's work because it's revolutionary, it's different. So how can they contact you? How can they access your work? And plug your book, your book.
Well, I've got a professional Facebook page. So if you just search for Dr. Jack Hunter, you should be able to find me on there, which is quite easy. And I'll update that all the time, post new articles and things that I write. I've also got a website, which is jack-hunter.webstarts.com. Bit of a long address, but hey ho.
No.
Yeah. But again, it's basically like my online CV. Everything is up there. You can see all of my publications and articles and things. Interviews get posted up on there. And then, you know, if you're interested in delving a little deeper, I've got a whole range of books, and you can also check out the Paranthropology journal. There's pretty much more or less 10 years worth of interesting articles on all manner of things to do with the paranormal and anthropology and parapsychology.
I'm going to be following up on that, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jack. And as always, thanks, dear. And for any of the guys that's actually listening on Facebook Live as well, thanks for joining in. It's much appreciated. As usual, dear is incredibly efficient, and we'll have this up on YouTube fairly quickly. And on top of that, I will then link that on my website as well. So thanks for joining us on this slightly spring-like day, but it's been an absolutely wonderful time, Jack. Really, really good. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye, Jack.
Bye-bye.
Right, folks. Thank you very much for that.